Hello, my name is Alex Garcia, and I'll be doing my presentation on the effect of chemogenic inactivation of the OFC during hierarchical learning. This was all research conducted with the Kiefel Lab here at UCSB under the Undergraduate Research and Creative Activities Grant. And just to start off, just for an overall statement, that context matters. So the processing of contextual information from the environment is essential for guiding appropriate situation-specific behavior. And so we kind of know this intuitively that, of course, when you go to a job interview, you would want to rigidly present your resume as a good candidate. But if you're something at if you're at something like a rave, of course, handing out your resume to people there is not going to be very appropriate. And basically just stating that intuitively that we accommodate our behavior to the situation that we're in. And of course, this has a huge implication for psychiatric disorders. So contextual processing is going to be affected in post-traumatic stress disorder, in schizophrenia, and in addiction for something like alcohol-relevant cues. And so cues in the environment are able to modulate the response to alcohol-related cues. So in people who have been previously alcohol dependent, the environment in which the cue is presented, whether it be social or non-social, will actually modulate the response to that cue. And then schizophrenic patients perform more errors on cognitive tasks that heavily involve context to decide the correct response compared to controls. Again, stating that there is this impairment in the ability to process and use context to change your behavior. And so, again, this is restated in that the dysregulation of contextual processing may be underpinning the inappropriate fear responses seen in PTSD. And so people with PTSD might not be able to understand that they're in a context in which it may not be adaptive to have a panic response. And so that might be one of the sources of sort of the misalignment from the stimulus in the environment and then the appropriate fear response seen in PTSD patients. And so that brings us to the question that what is context? So in the context of this investigation can be defined as any stimulus, external or internal, multimodal or unimodal, long or short lasting, that modulates the processing of in response to incoming stimulus. And so context can take the form of internal states such as emotion, whether you're happy or sad, that might change your behavioral output in response to a stimulus. And then also it could be environmental and sensory. So it could be something like light or auditory stimuli that is in your environment that you use to change your behavioral response. And so that brings us to one of the big concepts of this experiment, which is going to be context-dependent learning. And so in this experiment, we are using a context-dependent learning task where the context of the cage light for the subject will function to disambiguate the correct behavioral response to an auditory cue. And so what this looks like is that a stimulus will be presented in the form of an auditory cue, and whether or not the cage light is on or off will inform whether that cue is predictive of reward. And so this can come in two forms in this experiment. So one of them is going to be positive occasion setting. So in positive occasion setting, you're going to have a cue X, which is just a sound cue, in conjunction with the context. So while the light is flashing in the cage, that means that that set of cue and context combination will be predictive of a reward. And what we can see is that you have a higher conditioned response. So the amount of time that the animal is spending within the food cup will be increased when that correct context cue combination is experienced. And so in a negative occasion setting is the exact opposite. So the presentation of the cue and the context will be predictive of no reward. And of course, we can see the inverse effect in negative occasion setting, where the cue alone will be predictive of reward in contrast with positive occasion setting. And so for this experiment, we are going to be taking advantage of both of those positive and negative occasion setting to design a task which requires hierarchical learning. So the simple association of X means reward and Y means no reward is something that cannot be done here. And so there has to be some sort of hierarchical learning happening where that context is modulating the response of both QX and QY in a way that is positive and negative occasion setting. An occasion setting just representing the sensory properties of the context which inform the modulation of behavior. And so what this looks like in a task and just an overview of the experimental design is that we are going to train sets of rats, of Sprague Dolly rats, to under two discrimination types. One of them is going to be context dependent, and then one of them is going to be a simple discrimination. And in the context dependent discrimination, we're going to have a paradigm similar to described as before, with the positive and negative occasion setting, where X in context A is predictive of reward, Y in context A is not predictive of reward, X in no context A is not predictive of reward, and Y in no context A is predictive of reward. And in the simple discrimination, X is always going to be rewarded and Y is never going to be rewarded, no matter the context. So you can see that there are going to be two contrasting learning strategies that are going to be made by each of the discrimination types. In the first discrimination type, there are going to be these hierarchical associations made, where the animal has to integrate the sensory properties and the occasion setting properties of that context in addition to the cue presented in order to change their behavior. And so the behavior marker that is going to be measured in this is the time in the food cup. So the amount of time they spend within the food cup in a critical period after the cue is presented will be a measure of their anticipation of reward, or more abstract, as a symbol of their discrimination. How well can they tell that a cue is going to be predictive of reward versus when it is not? And of course, these hierarchical associations aren't going to be made in a simple discrimination paradigm where X is always rewarded, Y is never rewarded. Those aspects of the context never need to be integrated into the information that they face at the time of decision. And like we stated before, context-dependent learning task requires hierarchical learning. So contrasting with simple Pavlovian associations, a context-dependent task requires the creation of a cognitive map, also referred to as the task space or associative structures. This includes the complex cue-dependent associations, which can only be solved by a hierarchical model. And so in this study aims to use context-dependent learning to force the animal to use a hierarchical learning strategy. And so the importance of this is that it will be able to reveal some of the neurological basis of contextual modulation of reward prediction. And so kind of captured by this quote here, compared with simple forms of Pavlovian conditioning, there has been remarkably little investigation into the neurological basis of occasion setting. Fraser and Holland, 2019. And what this gets at is that we do know a lot about the neurological or the neurobiological basis for simple Pavlovian conditioning, the regions of the brain that are necessary to perform tasks that rely on simple Pavlovian conditioning. But in terms of this idea of occasion setting and more broadly complex and hierarchical learning, we know very, very little. And so one great candidate for investigation of the neurobiology of hierarchical learning is going to be the OFC. The orbital frontal cortex, which is presented here in the human, the macaque monkey, and the rat, is a region responsible for the modulation when faced with changes to cue and outcome associations, which can be exemplified by devaluation and reversal learning, which we'll get into more later. And so one advantage of the OFC as a region of interest and investigation is that it has a similar function and morphology across species. So cats, rice, mice, marmosets, monkeys, and humans have all demonstrated these aspects of function in terms of the devaluation and reversal learning. And as well, they share some morphological similarities. So they can be targeted within or across species, and you can maintain the same result, experimental result, and as well, you can get at a similar physical biological region in each of these species. And so initial theories have conceptualized the OFC as a value tracker, while newer research suggests a role in the representation of task structure. So really what we have seen in the literature is this move away from the OFC as a signal of value as used for only value-based tasks where the value changes during the process of learning. But these studies have been kind of backed by newer studies which have explained a lot of these results as the OFC as a representation of task structure. So it may be where in the brain these hierarchical associations live and where they are used by other brain regions to modulate behavior and to use that previously learned information of the associative structure to change the response to cues in the environment. And so exemplary of this is the OFC in devaluation and reverse learning. So first, to kind of capture devaluation, this is just the process by which an animal learns cue and reward associations. So a QA will be associated with one reward, QB might be associated with a different reward, and selectively, one of these rewards is going to be devalued. This is either by feeding the animal sufficient amounts of it in order to have them modulate the response to lower the responding to the original cue, or sometimes by pairing that reward with a chemical which makes the animal nauseous. And so during the devaluation, the OFC is needed at the time of decision in order to show that devaluation learning. So animals with OFC lesions will show that they have a flat responding, so they'll respond equally across both cues, and they won't show this selective modulation of their anticipatory behavior after devaluation has occurred. And so normal animals without lesions are able to do this pretty well. They're able to associate the cue with a reward, and then that reward with the devaluation. And so in response to the cue in a probe test, they will not respond as much. And in reversal learning, two cues are associated with a reward and no reward, and then the cue outcome associations are switched. So as seen as in this little picture, one cue will be predictive of a reward, another won't be, and then without the animal knowing, this will be changed, and the expression of this is you need the OFC to express this reversal. So the change from associating one cue with a reward and the other one with a not, that switch is going to be dependent on the OFC. And so what kind of this shows is that the animal is using the OFC to represent prior information in order to inform decisions later. And so this can kind of be captured by the OFC is involved with using previously learned information in conjunction with new information to guide decision making. And so with this movement away from value-based explanations, the OFC has been considered as having a role in representing cognitive maps during decision making. So this includes devaluation and reversal learning, but it can also include, but it also is reflective of economic choice task findings. So first, in this study is the core function of the orbital frontal cortex to signal values or make predictions. They argue that these different findings from devaluation, reversal learning, economic choice tasks, and studies on neural correlation all point to the OFC as this area that makes predictions based off of previously learned information, and specifically previously learned information that is dependent on associative structure or a task state representation. And so a study like the lateral orbital frontal inactivation dissociates evaluation sensitive behavior and economic choice can simply be broken down in that the orbital frontal cortex isn't needed during economic choice task where it's value dependent. And so it suggests that the OFC may not be involved in tasks which are involved with strictly changing that value function, and maybe have a broader role in terms of representing cognitive maps or associative structures during decision making. And so this is shown in the neurocorrelative studies of the hippocampus and orbital frontal cortex, or jointly represent task structure during memory guided decision making. And so this suggests that these areas are able to signal properties about the task structure during decision making in order to modulate behavior. And so newer findings have shown that the OFC may have a role in constructing cognitive maps. And so the OFC may be working like a cartographer, which is critical for the creation and usage of cognitive maps, also known as task space. And so one study that shows this very well is going to be the responding to preconditioned cues is evaluation sensitive and requires orbital cortex during QQ learning. And so here we have cues being associated with another cue, so A with B and D with E. And after this happens, and what can show this very well is going to be responding to preconditioned cues is devaluation sensitive and requires orbital frontal cortex during cue-to-cue learning. And so this is going to be using a very similar devaluation task, but in this case, cues will be associated with another cue, so A with B and D with E. And in this case, the orbital frontal cortex is inactive during that phase where they would be constructing a cognitive map. And when you do that, the devaluation, the effective devaluation is again not seen. And so what this suggests is that instead of the OFC representing these cognitive maps at the time of decision making, inactivating it during learning, the initial phase of learning, has the same effect. And so this can kind of suggest that it is needed for the construction of the cognitive map and not necessarily just for the usage of the said cognitive map. And so further research has established that the lateral orbital frontal cortex anticipates choices, integrates prior with current information. And in this study, it uses neural correlates to understand the orbital frontal cortex as kind of the signaler for which choice is the correct one given the circumstances based on a cognitive map. And then how does it do that when the task is changing over time? So it will integrate that the outcome of that first choice and use that to modulate behavior, which again shows this more complex role of the OFC in constructing a cognitive map, which is used later. And so then finally, we have this other study over the river through the woods, cognitive maps in the hippocampus and orbital frontal cortex. This suggests a role of the OFC in constructing cognitive maps again. And so it reviews several studies which show that neural correlates show the hippocampus and orbital frontal cortex working in conjunction to represent this task space in order to modulate behavior and predict reward. And so what may the role of the OFC be in terms of new learning? So after associative structures have been created, after this cognitive map has been created, what is the role of the OFC in integrating new information into that existing schema? And so from previously mentioned, during this Q to Q learning phase, the OFC is needed to construct that map. And before, we've also seen that during at the time of decision, the OFC is needed to represent these cognitive maps. And so what may be interesting is investigating specifically if the OFC is needed at the time of learning just one new piece of information and how that may be integrated into their existing hierarchical learning structure. And so a study which suggested this is possible is schemas in memory consolidation, which had rodents learn the locations of different pellets in an environment, which was predicted by odor cues within their cage environment. And so they were tasked with learning these complex associations between the odor cues and then the location of the reward. And so what they showed is that you can rapidly acquire new cue location associations, and that is mediated by having this previously learned structure. So animals with this previously learned schema are able to integrate the information very quickly, while animals without it are not. And then this process is actually not dependent on the hippocampus. So lesions of the hippocampus don't have an effect on this rapid acquisition phase. And they suggest that the neocortex might have a broader role in terms of integrating this new information into prior existing schemas. And so that leaves us a very good candidate in the OFC for this role of integration. And so what is the OFC's possible role in rapid acquisition? Before, we have seen that the OFC is needed during the construction of a task structure. The OFC is needed during the performance of an established discrimination based on previously learned associative structure. And so this can be seen in devaluation, reversal learning, and the new studies and that schemas and memory consolidation paper suggest that the neocortex is sufficient for integrating new information into previously learned associative structures, and that it's not just hippocampal dependent. And so then we can investigate using our context-dependent discrimination task, what is the role of the OFC when new information has to be integrated into a previously established associative structure. And so the goals of this study are to concretely demonstrate a Pavlovian learning task which is context dependent and relies on associative structures to accurately infer reward predictions. Simply put, that we are making a task which is sufficiently complex that it will only be able to be solved by hierarchical learning. So only through the construction of associative structures can the animals solve this problem of reward prediction based on context. And so then we are going to demonstrate the role of the OFC in representing these associative structures during decision-making. And then we'll, most importantly, and this is going to be unique to this study, is evaluate if the OFC is necessary to integrate new information into previously learned associative structures. So after the animal has extensively learned the task, when we give them new information about the task, how is that going to be affected if the OFC is turned on or turned off? And so all of these studies are going to be able to be compared to OFC inactivation during a simple conditioning task. So what do these effects look like if you take away that aspect of hierarchical learning and it's just simple conditioning? So just to be reminded, here we have the rodent model of contextual control of reward prediction. And so they're going to learn these rules over the course of many, many sessions. And what is unique about this study is that we are going to be able to integrate one new cue into this paradigm. So we will be taking Z, a cue Z, which is just a different sound cue, and at 3 presentations or 3 sessions of new learning. We will be inactivating during the presentation of QZ. The QZ will be presented for the context-dependent discrimination within context A, and it will be rewarded. And the same will be true in the simple discrimination. So it'll only ever be presented within one context, and in that one context, it will be rewarded. And so then what kind of predictions can we make about how the animal will use that information in a later test of that cue? So for the context-dependent discrimination, when that new cue is shown in context A and is rewarded, that will fit into their task rule that a cue is only ever associated with a reward within one context. So if the cue is presented in a different context, then maybe the animal will have to infer that it's not rewarded. In terms of the simple discrimination task, they know that cues are always rewarded no matter the context they're in. And so in terms of those task rules, Z will be rewarded in all contexts. And so we shouldn't see a discrimination change between the contexts in which we present that new information QZ. And so again, reinforcing, they're going to be learning over many, many sessions. And then they're going to be presented with this new QZ. And then we're going to test what they learn about that cue and see if it is necessary to have the OFC to make those inferences on the value of that cue. And so how do we achieve this? We achieve this through designer receptors exclusively activated by designer drugs. And so what these are receptors which are virally implanted into the OFC by an adenovirus. So that just means that at the time of inactivation, we can inject them with CNO, and that will selectively inhibit the OFC. And so rodents will be free to learn the conditional and simple discrimination task without any OFC inactivation. And then in a probe test of the originally learned cues of X and Y, the OFC will be inactivated. And then during new learning of a task structure, consistent Q Z, the OFC will again be inactivated. Then in a final probe test, the inferred learning from the new Q will be gauged without inactivation. So just an overall view of everything. There's going to be this extensive time of learning the task, surgery, and implantation of virus or of HM4DI receptors within the OFC. After that, there's going to be a phase of new learning where the QZ is presented. And then after that, we're going to be gauging what they learned from that other Q. And so these are going to be the results of the inactivation of OFC on acquired learning of context-dependent discrimination. And here we see a clear result that the OFC is needed for conditional discrimination. So for the control group, which is the mCherry group, mCherry is just a fluorescent tag used to identify if the correct region was targeted by the virus. And you can see that control subjects were able to discriminate very well. And so the Q context combinations were able to be learned over time in both groups, but within the control group, they were able to be expressed because the OFC was not inactivated. In terms of the subjects with the viral implantation, it seems that they lack that conditional discrimination once the CNO is injected. So compared to a vehicle, which is just a saline solution, that HM4DI group, when injected with CNO, has a lower discrimination ratio, which is just associated with a worse ability to discriminate when cues and context combinations are predictive of reward. And so this is consistent with previous studies showing that at the time of decision, the OFC is required to express this context or these hierarchical learning structures, which has brought about the context-dependent discrimination. And so this effect is not seen in simple discrimination. And this is also expected. It seems that the OFC is not required for some of these simple discrimination tasks. And if the principal function of the OFC is to represent task structure and hierarchical learning, simple discrimination does not require any hierarchical learning. So the OFC should not be required to express that simple discrimination. And that's exactly what is found in the data. You can see that the M-Cherry group and the HM4DI group, whether they got vehicle or CNO, were able to discriminate at very high ratios. So, moving on to the new learning phase. So this is going to be the conditional discrimination group. And during their new learning, they are being presented that QZ. The QZ is presented 10 instances during those 3 sessions, but under all of the sessions, CNO is administered. And you can see that the at the bottom graph, you can see that the time in port increases with time, increases with successive presentations of QZ. This indicates that the animal, despite having injections of CNO, is able to learn that QZ is predictive of reward. They're able to anticipate that QZ is biologically meaningful in terms of predicting a food reward. And so we can see that very similar results are seen in the simple discrimination group. Here you can see that in both conditions, the QZ is learned and discriminated at a very high, and it showcases that it has a predictive value with that time in port. And so for the probe test, where we take that QZ that was only presented in one context, and we do a probe test of the QZ now in that new context. And surprisingly, we see in the conditional discrimination group that the QZ is discriminated almost equally well, whether the subject had the control virus or the DREAD implanted in the OFC. So during that new learning phase, when they had the OFC inactivated, that they had little difference on how they used the cognitive maps after. And so this comes as a surprise, because if the OFC's principal role is to represent a task space and a task structure, it makes sense that it might be active and online during new learning in order to integrate those cues into the previously learned associations. So encountering this result is a bit surprising. In the simple discrimination group, of course, we see a slightly different result, but it indicates very similar results. So basically, just that the QZ has a similar time in port percentages in both contexts, because they did not learn that hierarchical rule that said that the Q is only predictive of reward in one context. So for simple discrimination, they show time reports equal across them, regardless of whether they had the control virus or whether they had the DREAD. And so basically, what does this mean? These results show that the OFC is required for established discrimination of a context-dependent task. So of course, aligning with previous results, we see that the OFC is needed for this established discrimination. And so to use that cognitive map during the time of decision, OFC is definitely learned, and it is true in this task as well. So this novel task, which uses context to bring about these hierarchical associations and learning, within this task, the OFC is required for the established discrimination. And of course, this is only in the context-dependent task and not the simple discrimination task. In the simple discrimination task, it's assumed that the OFC is not needed for that based on our results. And so the OFC is not required for the integration of new Q into the context-dependent discrimination task. And this comes as a surprise. It conflicts with our initial expectations that because the OFC maybe has this role in this broad role in representing the structure of the task, basically the rules of the game, why isn't it necessary to have this structure active during new learning? So the OFC is not required for the integration of the new Q into the context-dependent discrimination task. And so this conflicts with our initial expectation. Because the OFC is implicated in this broader role of representing the task structure or the rules of the game, it makes sense that the OFC would be on and active and necessary for the integration of new information into these pre-existing task rules. But that's not what we've seen. What we've seen is that it's not dependent on the OFC. You can turn off or disrupt the OFC during this new integration phase, this new learning phase of the QZ, and it won't affect even the context-dependent manner that which they learn that Q. So they will be able to infer that they aren't supposed to respond in the other context because those first presentations were rewarded. So meaning that they learned not only the hierarchical associations of the X and Y, but they generalized those rules to QZ. So QZ was learned within a rule, and it said that within this context, context A, it is rewarded, and within the no context A, it is not. And the animals are able to show that discrimination despite having the OFC disrupted during that time of new learning. And so this can be explained by other factors. Previous research has shown, has been involved in tasks which are much less complex, take less time to learn. And so through this extensively learned task, we may be bringing about the expression of other brain regions. Over time, the learning of this context-dependent task may be reliant on other brain structures. And it may be that other parts of the prefrontal cortex or the parts of the neocortex more broadly are able to accommodate for this disruption in the OFC after extensive learning. So those structures may be more active during the time of new learning and able to accommodate into cognitive maps, which are represented in other brain regions besides the OFC. So it may be just that other brain regions are active and the OFC is not needed for this integration of new learning. And it could be as well that it is temporally dependent, meaning that this also means that it could be temporally dependent. So research in this lab has also suggested a role of the hippocampus in integrating that new information. And it may be that this brain region, the hippocampus, which is involved in more of the short-term memory aspects, holds the information of this new cue and slowly accommodates it into cognitive maps represented in the OFC when it is active. So it may be that just at the time that is initially learned, that initial learning takes place in a unique brain region, and through a neural circuit, it is moved to the OFC over time. And of course, this can be also supported by the fact that after each learning session of that QZ, during those 10 instances, after those 10 instances of QZ presentation, there was a one-day break where they returned to the original Q learning. And so during that time, it could have been that slowly that information, which was initially represented in the hippocampus, is moved into the OFC. And of course, this is also supported by previous research that says that the task structure may be represented in both the hippocampus and the OFC. And so what this brings in is moves for the next direction, or this also leaves space. Jesus Christ. These results suggest new directions for this research. Of course, there is a weakness in the study in that some of the experimental groups with OFC expression of dread was very low. So in terms of the final probe test, only 5 members were used for the statistical significance. And so bringing on more members and more cohorts of these different discrimination groups may help in elucidating some of those effects, especially if they're smaller effects. With the increasing of subject number, we may be able to see these effects which were expected but not seen in this study. And this also brings about a question of what happens if you inactivate the OFC during that initial hierarchical learning. So during that extensive period that they're learning the task structure, if you disrupt the OFC during that time, does that have an effect on new learning, and does it have an effect on the model that they construct more generally? And so those are 2 new directions that the research could be taken in order to elucidate sort of the role of the OFC in constructing and maintaining these cognitive maps. And so that's all I have for today. This is the list of the references, and thank you so much for watching.